Hello, I'm Dahl Russell, and this is one of my pre-concert lectures that I gave for the Mid-Atlantic Symphony Orchestra. I'll include a link to their website down below. I'm going to do a little something different with this lecture. Usually, when I give a pre-concert lecture, I will be talking about at least 3 separate pieces, and I try to find a unifying theme for those pieces. But when I separate them out into lectures for YouTube, I usually try to make them distinct for each piece of music so I can easily link one piece of music to one lecture. Today, the first 2 are very strongly thematically linked. So I'm going to talk about both pieces of music, Dvorak Symphony No. 7 and the Violin Concerto of Ludwig van Beethoven. The overarching theme was formed by the conductor naming this program Eternal Prodigies. There's also a modern work in this program, but I did not have that as tied into the theme, so I'm going to do that one separately. So the program was entitled Eternal Prodigies. So I use that concept of prodigy as a touchstone for what I'm going to be talking about. As usual with my pre-concert lectures, I am not just talking about the specific piece of music that's in the program, but I'm also talking about concepts related to working in the arts and things that give you a broader scope to think about the music, the work of composers, the work of people who are working in the arts. So let's start by defining our term, prodigy, from the late 15th century, denoting something extraordinary, considered to be an omen, from the Latin prodigium, meaning a portent. The most common definition is, and now this is from the Oxford English Dictionary, by the way, a young person with exceptional qualities or abilities, as in a Russian pianist who was a child prodigy in his day. The secondary is an outstanding example of a particular quality, as in Germany seemed a prodigy of industrial discipline. And third, an amazing or unusual thing, especially one out of the ordinary course of nature. And that example is omens and prodigies abound in Livy's works. So I want to repeat that first definition and example because it is usually the only way that we are used to hearing the word prodigy used today. A young person with exceptional abilities or qualities, as in a Russian pianist who was a child prodigy in his day. Now, the inherent built-in usage with this problem is at the sting at the end of that sentence, the implication that a prodigious talent becomes inconsequential when one is no longer a child. By extension, it also implies that if you are not recognized as a prodigy, as a child, that you can never truly achieve a prodigious outcome. And all of our arts suffer from this today. And before you say, oh, but what about Grandma Moses? Remember how much of a prodigy she was, how unusual, simply because she was recognized in old age. That has become even more unusual than when she was recognized. So one of the things I'd like to encourage you to ponder long term, I'd like you to remember, to question, and to puzzle through how the concept of the child prodigy may actually warp recognition within the fields of the arts. And I'll touch on this again in context as I continue to talk about the various works. So this program ended, the second half was the Symphony No. 7 of Antonin Dvorak, and I happened to talk about this program in reverse order. Antonin Dvorak was born in 1841, the time period when Bohemia was considered the music school of Europe, and music was an ingrained part of the culture. Dvorak's father was an innkeeper and butcher, and he played violin, zither, sang, and played in the village band. So as a young child, Antonin Dvorak played the violin for his father's customers. He performed at village fairs, and he sang in the church choir. Now, we don't have a particular age assigned to these activities, probably because of circumstances. It was not considered important to his parents because they didn't think they were raising a musician. With multiple business locations, Father Dvorak wanted and needed a son to share in the running of the business. It's also possible that it wasn't notable because music was so much a part of the culture that Dvorak's early abilities weren't seen as remarkable. He was just another child playing violin as background music in his father's inn. Something that was distinctive and noticeable was his preoccupation with music, how he would avidly listen to older musicians in town and absorb the folk music of the region that, with hindsight, we now know was so much a part of his later work. By 14, his talent was significant and remarkable enough for a music teacher to recognize his aptitude and give him formal lessons in viola, piano, and organ. This teacher also made great efforts to raise funds for Dvorak to be able to study in Prague, and also tried to convince Antonin's father to let him study there. But the father, as with many parents today, insisted that music is a hobby, not a profession. So at 14, we do have a definitive recognition of extraordinary potential. At 16, Dvorak's uncle was convinced to put up the money for Antonin to study in Prague. It's worth noting that when he got to music school, he was not considered a prodigy there. Now, that may simply be a function of his early lack of opportunity and support, and this is why prodigy can be hard to define. It's always relative. Antonin was well regarded as an industrious student. He studied music theory, organ, memorized scores, played in the orchestra, and began to compose. Now, this was the 1860s, when much of the German world was in political upheaval, and a decline of the leisure classes happened that affected his father's business. So just a year into school, Dvorak's family businesses took a downturn for both father and uncle, and they used this as a way to make Antonin choose. Come home for good or be cut off and make your own way. And that is how Bohemia gained another musically talented innkeeper and butcher whose name has been forgotten. No, that's not what happened. Dvorak stayed in Prague and fulfilled his father's worst fears. He became an itinerant musician, playing with a variety of bands for tips, giving concerts, and gigging in orchestras. But with no other means of support, this is really what we should have expected. Much like Haydn in his youth, his skill was music, so he used it any way that he could to survive. Dvorak did put the funds he achieved from this towards continuing his musical education. These years and the years after graduation, he referred to as hard study, occasional composing, much revision, and a great deal of time thinking, and very little eating. Judi Dench, in an interview, had this to say about her acting career. It's all luck. This idea that the most talented person has the best career is simply not true. And I'm not saying this out of some false humility. It is just luck. You're lucky enough to be in front of the right people. You're picked to be in something where you get a break, and you're picked for something else. An acting career is all luck. Now, a lot of times we want to contradict that, but we do need to listen to her. And likewise, Audrey Hepburn, who constantly said, I've been very, very lucky. We could add as well that luck is an essential component of being a prodigy also. If no one had ever pressured Dvorak's father to get him better musical training, we would have had another innkeeper who played really well after dinner. There is a YouTube talk, only about 5 minutes long, done by the brilliant international pianist Mitsuko Uchida on the topic of Does Talent Matter?, where she also credits the importance of luck in a career. Now, Dvorak had significant luck when he entered a competition where Brahms was one of the judges. Brahms was not only impressed with Dvorak's entry, but with the volume of music that Dvorak had presented to them. Brahms considered that Dvorak already had a full catalog of works, and all of them good. So Brahms took it upon himself to introduce Dvorak to his publisher and to convince him to publish Dvorak's work, and then he pushed Antonin to compose the Slavonic dances, piano duets, which sold out the day they were available. And that's what we associate Dvorak with the most, nationalistic Slavonic works. But today's symphony, the Symphony No. 7, is a departure from that. It's something darker and said to be more personal. Dvorak was really struggling with himself in these competing desires to be a national composer on one hand, contrasted with his desire to be recognized for an international career and international aspirations. And the contrast of his career and his known shyness and desire to stay at home, these things ran very deep in his nature. Importantly, the focus of this work was a calculated intellectual choice as well, to create a symphony that had the scope of Beethoven and Brahms, something large in scale, something technically proficient, and something, as Brahms put it, something very unlike your Symphony No. 6, the New World Symphony. And he was an unmitigated success in this effort. His 7th Symphony is something distinctly different from his previous works. It's considered one of his masterpieces, and it was immediately considered flawless in both form and content. And of course, it cannot compete with the popularity of the New World Symphony, but in terms of its overall conception, the gravity of its emotion and its masterful formal treatment, Symphony No. 7 of Dvorak is referred to as a supreme example of symphonic writing which ranks alongside some of the most important works of the post-Beethoven development of the symphonic genre. In the praise of one critic, he compared it to a painting of gray on gray. Another praised its spontaneity and invention. And it was notable for being both modern, but still maintaining a classical structure and technique. Of course, the highest praise of any of these critics, and many of these critics, was to place it in prestige above the works of Brahms. I think we can say he set out to do what he intended to do. But still riding high on this success, artistic success, he had to squabble with his publisher. His publisher complained that so many of his more serious works were still sitting on a shelf in the back room unsold. And for this publisher, it was very easy. Stop working so hard on these symphonies. Just give me 2 more sets of Slavonic dances for piano duet and we'll sell them all. His publisher wanted only candy. So while we know and we love the New World Symphony, We don't want to be like his publisher. So we need to prepare ourselves for something deeper, technically proficient, and with the more subtle and profound beauty when we listen to the Symphony No. 7 of Antonin Dvorak. And I'll put a link to that right here. If you'd like to stop here and listen to that, then you can come back to the rest, or it might make more sense to listen to the whole thing as they're united on the theme of Prodigy, and then come back and listen to the individual pieces. The next work is the Violin Concerto of Ludwig van Beethoven. Now, despite the fact that Beethoven is always referred to as one of the great prodigies of classical music, the question does arise from time to time, well, was he actually a prodigy? And here again, we see this shifting definition of the word prodigy. It's interesting that in looking through definitions of the word prodigy, most do not attach a specific age to prodigy, either a minimum age or a maximum age. So Stephen Hawking, in his later years, could rightfully be described and introduced as the premier prodigy of physics. Britannica fixes a minimum age of around 10. But if you've had these conversations at all, usually the children we refer to as prodigies, even in Mozart's time, are younger than 10. Mozart is most often the comparison point for discussions of Beethoven and his prodigy. Mozart was 14 when Beethoven was born, so they were not in direct competition. The story goes that Mozart, at 4 years old, climbed on a bench and began to fiddle around with his father's harpsichord. And certainly Mozart was able to play, even as a youngster, the important instruments to professional standard, and made the rounds of the crowned heads of Europe to great acclaim. His first recognized composition dates from when he was just 5 years old. And this is where the standard of regard of other professionals becomes integral to the definition of prodigy. Britannia continues, in this sense, neither high intelligence nor eccentric skills by themselves qualify a child as a prodigy. Rather, it is the capacity to perform in a recognized area of endeavor in such a way as to achieve and receive broad acclaim that defines a prodigy. So Dvorak did have that. Recognized professionals recognizing him as proficient and having great promise, notably still needing further training, but having great promise. Now, certainly Beethoven's father knew about Mozart's success. And Beethoven's father being a struggling musician, he was trying to get a piece of that prodigy pie for himself. Beethoven gave his first professional concert at 7.5 years of age. His father, trying to cast him as another Mozart, claimed he was 6. This even caused confusion for Beethoven later in his life when he received his own birth certificate and he thought it was his older brothers who had died as an infant. Ironically, the fact that Beethoven's father tried so hard to promote him as a prodigy is actually something that has thrown Beethoven's prodigy title into question from time to time. In the same way that we don't like to think about the component of luck being part of an artistic career, we like to think that real prodigies are instantly recognizable, rising like Venus from the sea with perhaps a little more clothing on. We often forget that Mozart's father certainly cultivated and promoted him. Wolfgang's acclaim was just a little bit easier because Leopold Mozart was a successful musician with better career placement and recognition of his own, and he was already playing at court. So both of Leopold's children had excellent training, marvelous opportunity, and exceptional exposure. So they were ripe to be recognized as prodigies. So here's an example of luck again. Mozart's sister Nannerl had the misfortune of being just a few years older. So even if their capacities had been equal, it was easy for her to be eclipsed by a younger sibling. And then, bad luck again, she was a girl. So exceptional talent and exceptional brains would really be considered a problem in this day and age, not an asset. Beauty was the premier asset for young women in the marriage market. And as you look through the historical notes, her looks are rarely mentioned, which leaves us pretty significant historical indication that she was not a beauty, because the beauty was so rhapsodized in general when it was there. So because of that, because beauty was and remains today so highly prized for female performers, we can only wonder what her fate might have been if she had had the talent that she had and also been a great beauty. But I digress. From luck, let's go back to recognition as a component of prodigy. In 1782, before the age of 12, Beethoven published his first work, 9 variations in C minor for piano on a march by Ernst Christoph Dressler. So even if we add the disputed years back on to Beethoven's age, his first professional concert at almost 8, published works by the age of 14, I think we can agree we would still consider him a prodigy today. Now the words outstanding, amazing, and even monstrous are included in many definitions of prodigy. So given Beethoven's life work, he qualifies his prodigious output, his wrestling music from its early classical traditions into the beginning of the modern classical era, and then to become the Romantic era, his temper, his deafness, and then continuing to compose despite that really career-specific handicap. Definitely both a child prodigy and, more importantly, prodigious and a lifetime prodigy. The Violin Concerto that we're going to hear is in the central part of his large output. In 1803, Beethoven's Eroica Symphony was introduced to the world. Within a span of 6 years, he would produce that symphony, his 4th piano concerto, 2 of his most famous piano sonatas, the Waldstein and the Appassionata, and this violin concerto. Now, whenever I am researching a work of Beethoven's to talk about, I ask myself, where does this fall in relationship to the trajectory of his deafness? Other composers have love lives which define the ups and downs in their lives, but with Beethoven, it's more internal, and his deafness is central to what's going on in his life. His awareness of hearing trouble, and then the recognition of that it definitely was hearing loss, and then the drastic decline and inability to hear, and that creates a timeline and an arc to his emotions as his loss of hearing affected his life and his music. This violin concerto falls exactly in the middle of the very fertile period that is referred to as his middle period. 6 years into the certainty of his hearing loss. Now, this concerto happens to begin with a series of timpani strokes, which led some early critics to call this the Kettledrum Concerto. And this probably was a catty jab, a recognition that some people were becoming aware of his hearing loss, as well as to loudness and the mercurial nature of some of his other pieces. So they dismissed the whole thing on just the opening measures. Now, it's worth mentioning because of the symbiosis between Beethoven's use of more percussive elements across the board in all of his works in relationship to his hearing loss. And when you think about it, that's not really astounding. What should be astounding to us is that he didn't end up solely composing full volume works for brass and kettle drums. I mean, we could have understood that. You know, he was going deaf, so he was composing louder music, but no. Instead, we can marvel at the inclusion of these elements of volume and pounding repetitions within works that still contain stillness, fineness, and poetry. The kind of things that infuse this beloved violin concerto. This particular concerto in this performance where I gave this featured a very young violin soloist as well, which was part of the component of the Prodigy title. His name is Stefan Jackiw. So I hope you enjoyed this information, and the overarching thoughts about how Prodigy and the desire for child prodigies affected the careers of these composers and other composers, and still affects the arts today across the board. Thank you.